This is Nina Stoyan Rosenzweig. I'm interviewing Dr. Albert L. Rhoton Jr. Welcome, Dr. Rhoton. I would like to start out just by getting some basic biographical background information on you. So could you tell us where, when you were born, maybe a little bit about your family and childhood?
Mm-hmm. I was born in Parvin, Kentucky, in the poor part of Appalachia in the hills, in a log cabin delivered by a midwife in return for a bag of corn. There was no electricity. We carried water from a springs in the back of the house. I went to a two-room schoolhouse, a dilapidated two-room schoolhouse in the hills, and I don't think I heard the word physician during my early life. There were no doctors in the hills, and it wasn't until some years later that my parents moved out to Ohio, and we became city dwellers.
Well, that's really an interesting background. So what year were you born?
1932.
1932. And so if you didn't see physicians, did you have any health care when you were a child, or how did
Not very much. I had pneumonia one time in the hills, and my father told me that I almost died, and he went out and walked 20 miles, he said, through the snow to find a doctor, and the doctor gave him a bottle of castor oil to bring back to treat my pneumonia. It was before the days of antibiotics, and fortunately I survived.
That's really a fascinating story. Were your parents farmers?
Well, they were from an area of Kentucky that didn't have high schools. I think they were smart, and eventually they were able to get to Berea College, which is a work school that you could go to if there was no high school in your area. And they met and completed college at Berea, and eventually my father obtained a master's in chemistry from the University of Kentucky.
And so was this while they were living in the hills, or was this after they moved to the city?
It was mixed between hills. My father would leave home and go to the school for a semester, and my mom, although she didn't have a degree, was well enough informed that she could teach in the two-room schoolhouse. So he would go off to school, and she would stay back and teach and make a little bit of money. And that went on for 8 or 10 years until finally Dad completed his master's in chemistry.
Did you have brothers or sisters?
I have a brother and a sister. My sister's a nurse, and my brother's a retired oral surgeon.
And so was it your father's completing his master's degree? Was that kind of the impetus that took them from the backwoods to the city?
Yeah, after he completed that, it was near the beginning of World War II, and his area of interest was rubber chemistry, and the Japanese had captured most of the rubber plantations in the world, and we were needing to make synthetic rubber, and so he joined that program and didn't have to go into the service because that project was deemed important to the defense, and so he spent the war and refining, and had some patents on synthetic rubber that was used to power a lot of the vehicles that fought World War II.
So it sounds like you've come from a background of really innovative people then.
Well, I think hardworking. They came up in the Depression where, even a penny and a dime was valuable. And the importance was work was important. And my father, when we moved to the city, he insisted that I get a job and peddle papers, but first I sold papers on a street corner when I was 10 years old, and then when I was old enough to get a paper route, I carried papers, and I was a pretty good size. I could have played football or basketball, but my parents insisted that I keep my paper route, and my father always said that, every day of life you should go to work, and the only reason not to go to work is if you're sick enough that you think you're going to die. And if you think you're going to die, why, maybe you can stay home. But otherwise, I want you to go to work. And so in the 40 years since I've come to the University of Florida, I had surgery one day under general anesthetic, and that was the only illness day I think I took in 40 years, although you don't feel good every day, but still he imbued in that we work every day.
So then they moved to the city, and it was Ohio. What city in Ohio was it?
In Akron.
Okay, and you were probably then about 7 or 8, if it was close to the beginning of World War II.
Yeah, I was I was probably 11 or 12, okay, possibly. I know that when we moved to the city, I was in, I think, the 5th grade.
Okay.
And the city school said everyone that came from that part of Kentucky, they put back 1 year in the city schools just automatically. But my mother had taught in the schoolhouse, and she would not let them put me back a year. So I went into the 5th grade and flunked it. So I took 5th grade twice. I'm probably one of the few people that flunked the 5th grade and finished first in their medical school class. So.
Well, I would imagine going from a 2-room schoolhouse to an urban school was also quite a significant change in just the whole atmosphere and probably how you learned as well.
That taught me a lot. Mm-hmm. Also about getting along with different kinds of people, and so it was quite a change in life and view of school.
And so I guess at this time your father is working as a chemist. What interested or what brought about your interest in medicine, do you think?
When I started college at Ohio State, I thought I wanted to be a chemist, but I had to work, and initially I was cleaning labs and washing dishes and waiting tables, but then I found a job working with boys' clubs in a settlement house. It was mainly underprivileged and mostly black kids, and I found I loved that work, and so I switched into social work and thought I wanted to be get a degree in group work and recreation and make my life working with those kids. And the last semester of that effort, before I received my degree in social work, I took a class in physiologic psychology and began to learn about the brain. And the teacher, Donald Meyer, was an inspirational teacher. And by the end of that course, I'd said, I want to work with the brain, and I want to be a neurosurgeon, so that was my new sort of target in life, and so that I received my degree. And then I started all the courses in pre-med, and I had good grades in social work. It was the program that most of the football players and cheerleaders were in. So for someone who was really studying hard, why, I had good grades. And then I started pre-med, and I still had a job, and I was taking chemistry and physics and biochemistry and all of these. And I remember my first round of tests, I flunked every one of them in those subjects. I realized I had to stop working, and I borrowed some money from a friend. I was considering shifting because I didn't know if I could get along without the income from working. I wrote to my dad, and he wrote me a letter back that I was asking for some money, and his comment was that it does a boy good to go hungry, and there was no money there. But a friend of mine who was in the church group that I was in, Wesley Foundation, a Methodist group, I was saying, I think I'm going to have to give this up. And he was a flashy kid who drove a red convertible around campus and obviously had money, and I didn't ask him for money, but he said, you know, I've collected $1,000 in quarters, and I'm going to give you my quarter collection. And so I had $1,000, and I stopped working. I lived on that for the year. I used the time to study. I came out of all of those courses with A's at the end, and had several places come through with some kind of scholarship. I eventually went to WashU, but some years later I was visiting faculty at Ohio State, and I wanted to go back and tell this professor, it was 15 or 20 years, that taught that course in physiologic psychology, what a change he had made in my life. And I went back to the psychology department. He had died, and I was just one of many young people in that class, and he never knew the impact that he had made on my life. And it sort of reminds me in the work that we do in medicine and as teachers that oftentimes we touch lives in very important ways that that you never know that you're doing it. I read this book, 5 Persons That You Meet in Heaven, and it carries sort of that theme to it, that oftentimes in a very important way you're touching the lives of others, and yet they never say anything to you. The contact is brief and fleeting, but many times all of us have significant impact on the lives of others that we never truly realize until maybe we get to heaven.
And I appreciate that you wanted to make the effort to contact this person and let him know what an impact he made on you. And I guess I was just thinking recently about my own, we'd asked some fourth-year students to tell us or write about the most important mentor that they had in their lives. And I realized that for me, it was actually an elementary school teacher who had kind of the biggest, and I've certainly met influential teachers, but I don't know if she recognizes how much she changed my life. But I guess it's something that we all like to hear that we really should make an effort to do while we can.
Yeah, and it's, events, like that often shape what happens to you. I was at Ohio State at the time, and when I took this year of pre-med, the lady who ran the settlement house where I'd worked with the kids, as a graduation present, gave me the money to go to a church camp in Vermont. And one of the people at the church camp was the registrar from Washington University. And I had never heard of Washington University in St. Louis. And I met the registrar and got to know him during the week a little bit, and left the camp. I didn't think anything more about it. And then a month or so later, I received an application to Washington University Medical School from him, and I remember spilling a bottle of ink on it when I was trying to fill it out, and it was the first one I filled out. I thought, well, I'll do it for practice, and I was accepted to Ohio State to medical school, and then I received a letter to come to WashU to interview, and I wasn't going to do it. And then I told one of my instructors in the pre-med courses that I'd been invited to interview at WashU, and he said, you should absolutely do it. So I remember hitchhiking from Columbus out to St. Louis to interview out there, and when I was accepted, it was between Ohio State and there, and everyone said you should go to WashU, so I went to WashU for med school.
And why did they recommend WashU? They thought it was a more...
They just thought it was, at the time, that the science was better. They had several Nobel laureates that were teaching there. They thought it was just a outstanding med school, and and they offered me a scholarship, which helped.
Yes, definitely. Do you remember what the costs were like for medical school at that point?
I don't, but I had a tuition scholarship, and then I was still working part-time, and as a medical student, I was actually one of the hospitals in the city used medical students for giving OB anesthesia. So I had a job giving OB anesthesia, and so that took care of most of my expenses. I think when I left medical school, I had, $4,000 in loans that I'd had to borrow a little bit.
But not a huge amount.
Yeah, not an overwhelming amount.
And so let me just ask you a few questions about, growing up during the World War II. I wonder if there are any memories of that time that you have, just about kind of civilian life, anything to do with...
Well, it was, there was rationing. We didn't have a car, and we're in a fairly big city, so you rode buses. And I have a very big foot, and it was hard to find shoes that fit me, and I was always wearing smaller shoes. So my shoes were wearing out fast. And at that time, we had to buy shoes, you got a certain number of stamps and stamps for sugar and food. And so I had a brother and sister and my parents, but I wore out my shoes so fast that I still remembered I used the shoe stamps from the whole family, that you still had to buy the shoes, but you couldn't buy them unless you had a stamp to go with it. It was when rationing for the war effort was so great. And then at the end of the war, they started to make cars for sale in the U.S., and by that time my father had enough money to buy a car for the family, and so that was a little bit of a life-changing event.
Definitely. And did you have family that were still in Kentucky that you ever visited?
Oh yeah, and
family?
we still do. My mother had 13 children in her family, and there were 4 children in Dad's family, and some of those children had 8 children, and so there was a big family clan down in the hills. But the war and the war effort and the building of the interstate highway system helped most of them eventually find their way out of the hills.
And I guess one other question, and this is just for my own interest, do you have memories of polio or any of epidemics of the time?
Oh yeah, we used to fear that. That was growing up. Every summer there was, polio scares, and everyone was very fearful of it. At times they would close down the swimming pools, and that slowed me down a little bit, because the one sport you could go out for when you had a paper route after school was swimming, because the coach just listed the workout every day, how far you had to swim on the blackboard, and you could go in every day and swim your laps, and after you had peddled your papers. And so I was on the swimming team in high school, and
And so
I was
the pool
actually
closed.
offered a scholarship at FSU for swimming, but I decided to go to Ohio State instead.
Interesting. So I guess when the pools were closed, it meant you couldn't
Yeah, it
swim.
couldn't work out.
So, obviously then you weren't dependent on having to meet with your teammates to practice at a particular time.
Yeah, the only time we were all together was at the meets then.
Did you have a particular stroke that, or?
Yeah, I was doing sort of the long distance freestyle.
Okay. Was that something you continued in college?
I started out in college and was good enough to make the swim team but not get a scholarship. And so in order to make ends meet, I had to give up the swimming to work. And
So I guess I'll just go ahead and jump forward to medical school. How large was the class of students?
I believe it was around 100.
So it was probably a medium-sized class.
Mm-hmm.
Were most of the students there from Missouri or from the Midwest?
No, they were scattered all over the country. And I recall quite a few from New York and New England, but a number from California and some Floridians.
And I guess at that time you started medical school in 1954. 55?
55.
55, okay. So there wasn't even, well, the UF College of Medicine hadn't opened at that time, since that opened in 56.
Yeah.
So. Was the curriculum similar to what it is today, with first 2 years of basic science and then you moved into clinical work, or did you start in the clinics from the
Yeah, it was 2 years of basic science. They had a few patient demonstrations by faculty along the way, but basically it was just basic science the first 2 years. I recall that we did have Berg and Kornberg. I think they were teaching biochemistry, and they went on to win Nobel Prize for synthesizing DNA. And I remember we were synthesizing probably the first medical school class to synthesize DNA in the lab as medical students. And there were a lot of wonderful faculty there, but my desire to do brain and neurosurgery never waned, so every summer that we had vacation, I went to one of the neurosurgery labs and had a job in the neurosurgery lab and did that, and that was always my first love in medical school.
Okay. And so did you find, though, that in professors who were inspiring, if not in a particular specialty, at least in their approach to medicine?
Yeah, there were, some wonderful teachers. The one thing that impressed me was the one thing that I was most interested in was neurosurgery, and I love the thought of being able to help people using skills related to that, but it was a pretty grueling specialty, and the professors were demanding and not very gentle, or at least as far as the residents, you didn't feel always a great sense of understanding or compassion among them for you, but they worked tremendously hard to do difficult things for their patients that today are so much easier to accomplish because of modern technology.
And what kind of neurosurgical procedures were possible at that time, or had been kind of pioneered?
Well, we were able to remove brain tumors, but to contrast it, at that time, there was no MRI, no CT. So basically, every day began with either pumping air into the brain through holes in the head or through lumbar puncture needles to try to float enough air in to see if there were some shifts in the brain, or the residents were putting needles in carotid arteries and injecting dye almost right in the X-ray beam to see if some of the arteries were pushed around. And today, operative procedures for brain tumors are very focal, where, we turn a small bony opening, but in those days, localization was so poor that if there was one flap for the front of the head, a piece of bone that you elevated that was almost the whole anterior half of the head, or one for the back of the head, and because you were never very precise in localizing it, so you needed to look around. There were lots of problems with brain swelling
After surgery?
After surgery, and just nerves that we routinely save today. At that time, we couldn't even see or know that they were involved in the tumors. So although you would save a patient's life, oftentimes they came out with significant deficits that they had to live with. And CT, MRI, modern clinical electrophysiologic monitoring, better anesthesia, microsurgery, all of these things have helped refine the specialties to where it's a much more safer, accurate, more gentle for our patients. And so we've come a long way over those years.
And so when you were working in the labs, neurosurgery labs, as a medical student, what kind of work were you doing?
I was mainly working on trigeminal nerve, and trigeminal nerve is the side of trigeminal neuralgia, the most intense pain that a human being can experience. And I was helping one of my professors with experiments on cats that pain was, you could induce it pharmacologically, and then there were a number of agents that were being tested to determine whether they benefited patients with that problem. But still today, many of those patients, even with all the years of great molecular biology and pharmacology, many of those patients still need neurosurgery to control the problem.
And what leads to that problem?
We think that it's demyelinization in the root of the trigeminal nerve where it enters the brain stem, and that leads to the pain fibers short-circuiting, that an impulse in a different group of pain fibers will trigger a strong physiologic response in the other pain fibers. And so it's a disease that we still think of as the most painful affliction known to man.
It's kind of a cascade of pain response.
Yeah, it hits like a hot poker going in the face, and patients are unable to eat. A breeze or just touching the face or food to the lips or trying to shave will trigger spasms of pain that literally bring patients to their knees. It occurs in various forms, but the most intense form is tremendously disabling.
And is there a reason why the demyelinization occurs? Is it associated with MS?
It has a higher incidence in MS patients, but usually the patients with MS who have trigeminal neuralgia have significantly advanced MS, so we don't think it's a variant of MS, but MS patients often get it on both sides of the face, and those are some of the most desperate people that I've seen over my career. And because I was studying this early on, I've always had an interest in that. And after I finished my residency at WashU, I went to the Mayo Clinic on the staff, and I had, among other things, a big practice in trigeminal neuralgia. And then, although I did many other things in neurosurgery, after coming to the U of F, I treated several thousand patients with this problem and served for years on the medical advisory support group for the trigeminal neuralgia Association, and I think played some role in the national office of Trigeminal neuralgia, the support group, relocating its office to Gainesville. And they have a registry of something like 25,000 patients with this condition that they are in correspondence and deal with, and try to help them find the best form of treatment for the problem.
And that started, of course, as you were a medical student. And you've mentioned your residency a few times. So you graduated from medical school, you were the first in your class, and this was 1959. And in that period, an internship year tended to be maybe a little bit more separate than it is today. But you did a general surgical internship in New York City?
Yes, at Columbia Presbyterian.
Okay. And what was that like? What kind of patients were you seeing there, and were you able to continue any kind of brain work or research?
Yeah, it was really, it was all general surgery. We rotated through orthopedics and the emergency room and the general neurosurgical services, but really no time related to brain. When I was there, I became friends with a number of the neurosurgery residents, but at that time the Brain Institute there was a separate building, and I never rotated through it, but through the contacts with the residents, I became friends. And I knew, though, when I started my internship that I was going back to WashU for residency, but I found that the neurology programs, neurosurgery at Columbia, were great, and Houston Merritt, one of the great neurologists of the time, had the neurology service. Juan Taveras headed the neuroradiology. There was a group of great neurosurgeons, and my friends and the service agreed to let me, after my internship, go to the Institute and take a year there before I went back to Barnes Hospital for my residency. And that was a great service that I really enjoyed that year, and still have many friends among the group of residents that I met there at that time.
And that was, so that was neurological surgery, and I guess I would ask again, like, what kind of patients were you seeing? Was that was obviously more specialized. Was it focused on the brain, or kind of also spinal cord?
Well, it was mainly brain and craniotomies for brain tumors and aneurysms. There was no level 1 trauma center there at the time, and so that it was mostly elective cranial neurosurgery. They also did spine, which was mainly ruptured discs and spinal cord tumors, but always the thing that excited me was what I think of as the crown jewel of creation and evolution, the brain. So that was the thing that always, all through my career, has sort of been the focus of what I've done.
And so, given your passion for the brain, this may seem like an obvious question, but could you tell us more about why the brain is so fascinating for you?
Yeah, it controls so many functions, and it was just so exciting to me in that course in physiologic psychology, that to think that if you understood this complex mix of nerve fibers and tracts, and understand the function that speech is here and movement of the thumb is here and the toe is here, and your ability to recognize things in space is here. And then to design approaches to all of that where you could help patients with very serious problems. That just looked like a wonderfully exciting challenge and a great way to try to help people. And I've always had the feeling that the brain is truly the crown jewel of creation and evolution. I think it's still our greatest unexplored scientific frontier. It's still sort of a source of mystery and wonder to me. It's the most frequent site of crippling, incurable disease. Some people say it's the seat of the soul. I don't think it's necessarily the seat of the soul, but I think it's through our brain and mind that we become aware of our own essence, of our own being, of our own soul. Some people say, I love you from the depth of my heart, or trust me from the depth of my heart, but really the center of emotion and love and maybe compassion and kindness is not so much in the heart, but it's up in the brain, and maybe in that little area that's called the hypothalamus that controls many aspects of human emotion. So maybe it's better to say I love you from the depth of my hypothalamus than from my heart. But the brain is, even today, still an exciting source of mystery and wonder, and I love the challenge of trying to help young people learn to make what is a delicate, faithful, awesome experience for their patients more accurate, gentle, and safe. That's, what teaching neurosurgery is all about.
Well, I was going to ask you, if I were going to ask you a question about what appeals to you, I would have used the word mystery. So I'm kind of pleased to hear that you use that a number of times. That there is also the challenge of just how much we don't know about the brain, as well as what we do. And I guess at that time too, you've talked a little bit about the types of surgeries, and that there were limitations, of course, due to technology. But did you find that a challenge? Were you thinking about ways of refining that surgery at the time?
Well, that was I would say an effort that challenged me, and I saw in gaining a better understanding of anatomy of the brain, I saw that as a way of improving my own surgery. And it was right at the time that the operating microscope was coming into place. A good example is, or several good examples are dealing with acoustic neuroma, which is a tumor on the nerve of hearing, and it involves the facial nerve, which, if the facial nerve is lost, it leaves a disfiguring facial sagging face with inability to close the eye and smile. And during my training in dealing with these tumors, I never saw a facial nerve preserved. Another area that tumors occur is the pituitary gland, the master gland in the body. And it was in the days when we didn't have replacement hormones, and when you removed a tumor in the pituitary gland, usually the gland was not preserved, and the lack of that gland and the lack of replacement hormones changed the patient's whole level of energy, their life, and even led to death. And there were just so many examples of this, and I thought if I learned the anatomy better, that I would be able to do a better job for my patients. And so I took a special fellowship in anatomy, an NIH-funded fellowship after I finished my training, and I started to look at the anatomy of this area, found a lot of areas where that understanding the anatomy better made my surgery better. And I think that, the things that I did during that year led to me being asked to join the staff of the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. They had wanted me to stay at Barnes, but when I visited there, I saw it as a wonderful place to practice medicine, and they wanted me to incorporate these things into their practice there and into the training of their residents. And so I, continued these studies of anatomy. I thought of them initially as just a way for me to learn to do a better job for my patients, and then I found out that other neurosurgeons and the residents were interested, and the residents then began to come to my lab to add to this science. I'd not considered writing any papers, but I found out other people were interested, and we began to write about it. Over the years, it's turned into hundreds of scientific publications, honors from around the world. When I came to the University of Florida, it was one of the things that I wanted to continue, and we were running the residency program and trying to incorporate this into the residency program. But at this point, because of the early articles, there were young people from all over the world that were wanting to come, and I started to take young neurosurgeons that had academic appointments from other universities to come and work with me in the lab. They worked from 1 to 3 years in the lab before going back to their academic position at home to teach this. I had a little motto with all that program that I call every second of every day, and I wanted there to be someone during every second of every day that was having surgery that was benefited by this program. And over the last 40 years, I've always had, in addition to our resident, 3 or 4 fellows from other countries with me working in my lab on these projects and writing. There are several dozen of chairmen of departments around the world today that have spent time with us. The people who've come through the lab and learned this way of looking at things and approaching neurosurgical pathology are regarded as some of the best neurosurgeons in the world. I think there's 12 chairmen of departments in Japan, 3 in Korea, 4 in Brazil, several in Europe. And after I arrived here to teach this anatomy to surgeons who were already practicing, I set up a lab in our little neurosurgery department at the time, and every month for 10 years ran a course at the 7 workstations that at one time, when I counted, we had 1,000 neurosurgeons come through that lab, and I just this year have taught courses all over the world, in China, Brazil, Europe, Chile, Korea, and the next year looks the same way, so that all of this still is relevant. We still have these fellows in the lab. We have a great residency training program, and these are postgraduates, and I think we've reached right around 95 of those people that have studied with us this year and up to this year, and I'm hoping that next year we have our 100th fellow come in that program.
That's really remarkable. And I'm going to ask you more details about what you're describing. I did want to just kind of confirm a few of the dates. You spent 3 years in New York and you mentioned earlier
I think
that
it was 2.5.
2.5.
Mm-hmm.
That your residency really, and this is true of neurosurgery.
Mm-hmm.
After that, you went back to St. Louis for another 3 years.
I think it was 5 years, maybe,
Okay.
by the time I finished the fellowship.
Okay, and that fellowship was also at WashU.
Yes.
So that, and that at the time when you mentioned that you became interested and saw the knowledge of anatomy as really being the key, were you pretty much the only person who was taking that view, who really said?
No, I think there were other people. There was a group of people around the world that were beginning to feel that, and although I think if you, and this is what my friends tell me, if you ask anyone almost in the world today who's led the way and who still has the strongest program in microsurgical anatomy, who's doing the best teaching in this area in the world today, I would say that they would say, University of Florida. Dr. Lombardi told me that once he was out visiting in some other country and he met a neurosurgeon, and he said to the neurosurgeon, "Do you know Gainesville?" And he said the neurosurgeon told him, "If you don't know Gainesville, you shouldn't be in neurosurgery." So I thought that was a little bit of a tribute to the program.
I would say definitely. So in terms of your life, though, after your fellowship in 1965, I'm going to just ask you about your family, and I don't know when you met your wife or when you were married. But
yeah, we met when I was in medical school, and she was in OT school at Warsh University, and I learned early on the best way for me to learn something was to teach it. And I think my classmates realized that in medical school. So if I could find anyone that would listen to me or needed help, but the occupational therapy students were studying fetal circulation, and they were having a hard time understanding it. And so one of them came to me and asked me if I studied in the medical library every night, and they asked me if I would help them understand fetal circulation. And so I got a group of them together and taught them about fetal circulation, and I met my wife in that group. And I think we may have had a cup of coffee after one of those sessions, and friendship started, and we were married a couple of years later.
And you have 4 children, and it looks like you must you certainly inspire them with your passion for medicine, because I see that of those four, three are MDs and one is an RN.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way. Conversation at home was all sort of family, and I don't think I ever said to one of our children, I'd like for you to go into medicine. I think they never heard their mother say, don't you do what your dad's doing. No, I'm sure Joyce was always quietly supported, and so it was a surprise to us that the children wanted to go into medicine or do medically related things, and I'm thrilled that all of them are happy doing that.
Well, I suspect that since you have such a great passion for it, that they saw how happy it made you, and that I'm sure that had an impact on them.
Maybe they know that it was what I was committed to and felt was worthwhile and enjoyed. And
when was your first child born? I guess, is Eric the first?
Yeah, Eric, who's a neurosurgeon now, was born in '59 while I was an intern and on call at Columbia Presbyterian.
Where were you? I know that even in the 50s, housing in New York was not necessarily easy to get or affordable. Were you living in the city itself?
No, we couldn't afford the city, and so we lived across the George Washington Bridge from Columbia Presbyterian in an apartment there, and we had one car, so if Joyce needed the car for the kids, she kept it and drove me up to the George Washington Bridge and in the morning, and I rode the bus across. And then came back across the bridge on the bus, and she met me then.
Okay. And then the rest of your children were born while you were a resident, or kind of throughout that period?
I think the two boys were born at Columbia Presbyterian, and two girls were born after I went back to Barnes Hospital.
Okay. And then by the time you went to Mayo in '66, you were there as a instructor at that time. Your whole family came with you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you were an instructor for, looks like 3 years, and then became an assistant professor. So you were there for a total of 6 years.
Yes.
Did you consider staying at Mayo at all? Or was that...
Well, I had a wonderful practice at Mayo, and a nice lab. The program at Barnes at the time, residency program, had trained more chairmen of departments than any other neurosurgical program in the country, and just the attitude of the place made you wanted to be a teacher, and I must admit, the other thing that I had on my medical school application was that I'd considered being a medical missionary, and actually considered going to seminary at the time that I was considering medicine, and I sort of had the feeling that I'd like to get out and at some program that wasn't as developed and try to build a neurosurgical program. And when I came to look at the University of Florida, I thought it looked like a nice place to live. I'd always wanted to live in a small city so that I didn't have to fight the traffic of a place like New York City or St. Louis. And I found a small department at what looked like to me was going to be a growing academic medical center, and I guess it was still that sort of missionary instinct that made me want to get out and try to build something a little bit like what we had at Mayo. But I must admit that was a wonderful, busy, outstanding place to practice with good trainees. When I went there, I thought that I would probably spend my whole life there. But there were these things that I still wanted to explore, and teaching that I wanted to do. And at the end of 5 years, I found myself with such a busy neurosurgical practice that it looked like there was not going to be an opportunity to do any of those other things. It was one day in the clinic, operate the next day, and it became that way day in and day out. And I love taking care of the patients, but I sort of had this gnawing desire to try to build a program, to try to advance some of these insights that we had into trying to create roadmaps to surgery that made surgery more accurate, gentle, and safe for patients. And I saw the opportunity to put this together in a way that we could do all of those things. And so I took a cut in salary and made the jump.
Well, I guess we've been talking about your desire to build a program and the opportunity you saw for that at the University of Florida. So you came to the College of Medicine in Gainesville in 1972, and I notice you're chief of neurological surgery. Was that a separate department at the time, or was it a
part of the Department of Surgery?
Okay.
And which was okay, because at the time when I came, we were 2 neurosurgeons. I remember we had, I think, 2 secretaries in the group, and we operated 3 days a week. We had 1 operating room. It was a small service, and there appeared to be a lot of rules in place at the time that kept the momentum down, and so that just gradually over the years the clinical volume grew to where when I turned over the program, that we were running commonly 5 operating rooms every day, had a much greater volume of surgery. At the same time, we had built some of the best, I think, teaching programs in the country. After leaving Mayo, where everything was so great, initially it was a little, I guess the word is depressing. I was not very well known at the time, and I recall the first year I was here, we only had 2 applications for the residency program. Every year that grew, and I was so excited when I got a residency applicant that I actually went to the airport, met them, they stayed at our house. But over the years, then it grew to where, for our positions, we were getting 200 applications a year, so it was not possible at that time meet everyone at the airport and have them stay at our house. And it got to the point where it was impossible really to interview everyone, and we became so very selective. But it was interesting that those first two residents have really had wonderful careers, and one of those two people has been a department chairman, and but it's been fun to see that aspect of it grow. It's been fun to see the clinical programs grow, the residency grow, and then the training and research programs. And when I came, neurosurgery was a money-losing venture, and I so much wanted to build this lab where we could study anatomy and run courses for neurosurgeons, and basically there was no money there. The dean didn't have much money to help me. I wasn't smart enough to, like a lot of people that come as chairman, that come with a long laundry list of things. My feeling was, I liked the opportunity and let me get in and try. And so that finally, through a private donor, I found $20,000 and was able to get the lab started with that. And it came out of a family called the Gildred family. And I was very interested in expanding that. And so I was trying to fundraise in a number of different ways, and met the Keene family, and the Keenes have a plaque that's out beside my office that says, "Done to the glory of God." But I'd taken care of 3 family members, became friends with the family. They had a large citrus business in Orlando. I presented to them what I wanted to do, and they gave the first $1 million cash gift that was given to the university system in the state of Florida. And it was before the matching program. Bob Graham was the governor, and he was so excited about someone giving $1 million to the University of Florida that he came down and they held a reception for the family over at the president's house. And so that gave a tremendous boost to the program. And then I think the excitement over that, the legislature started to get excited about, giving to the University of Florida. And I must admit that when I talked to a lot of people, they said, it's a great university, but we only give to private schools. And up to that point, the Keenes had only given to private schools. But then I think the excitement in the legislature and Bob Graham's interest led to the beginning to discuss the matching program. And then in a variety of ways and people that we met over the years, that led to then 11 endowed chairs or professorships. By the time that I turned over the chair, I think it was more than probably in any other department in the medical schools, in any medical school in the country. And as the department began to grow, the interest in having us move to departmental status, and I don't recall the exact date, but sometime in the early 80s, in a split vote in the executive committee, we became a department, and that helped us in many ways. One of the most rewarding chairs has been the Rhoton chair, which has grown to be a $5 million chair that was made up, I think, by many of the donors and the other chairs coming together at the time I stepped down as chairman. So they had been fundraising to create the Rhoton chair to be put in place that would go to the chairman of the department right a few weeks after I stepped down as chair of the department, after I think 26 years. But it's been fun to see, the quality of education grow, the stature of our faculty grow, to see the clinical programs grow, to see the educational aspects of what we offer increased. And it was rewarding to know when I turned it over that the department had, I think, I don't know the exact number, but certainly more than $20 million in endowment. And a number of those donors continue to increase, and still some of those donors are helping me keep the lab that I still have where the fellows come to at the U of F. So it's been a tremendously rewarding experience, academically, clinically, from friendships that have developed over the years. And as I look back on it, it's, I think, brought a lot of honor to the university. And I didn't go into this to really receive any honors, but certainly the largest honors, highest honors that the neurosurgical groups in the U.S. have to offer have come our way. And I think some of the most prestigious honors out in the world, like the Medal of Honor of the World Federation of Neurosurgical Societies, and honors from the Norwegian and Swiss and Australian and Australasian and other societies have come our way as a reward, as a part of the reward for the work that we've done here, or come just as a reward for what has happened here and for the contributions that the department has been able to make to neurosurgery.
And I guess we've talked about your own interest in neurosurgery, and I'm going to loop back to that. But I think as a division chief and certainly as a chair, it's obviously not just about what you're doing, but also how you're inspiring others. And I know you mentioned that there's just one. Who was the other neurosurgeon who was here when you came?
Frank Garcia, Garcia Bengochea, who had trained at Columbia and Mass General, and who was really an outstanding neurosurgeon, was the lead neurosurgeon in Cuba. And then after the revolution, he came to the U.S. and was a wonderful person to work with and a great surgeon.
And you mentioned in the first two residents, who were they?
One is Bill McGavern, who went back to Texas, and the other is Arthur Day, who became a great cerebral vascular surgeon.
And who was at the University of Florida for a while and now is in Boston?
Was in Boston and is now, later in his career, considering, I know, joining up some way with Mayo.
Okay.
I'd love to see them come back here, but they're new people, you know, when through the friends, I was having all the money I needed for my lab, and so as I worked with the donors, why I was saying to them, the amount of money that you're giving me for my effort, I have what I need to, but, you know, we have cerebral vascular surgery, and if we can just collect together your gifts over a few years, we'll have enough money to fund a chair in vascular surgery, and that's the one that Dr. Day held in the department. And then we did it for stereotactic surgery, pediatric surgery, spinal surgery, computer-assisted surgery, and just they were people that had become friends that were helping us, that the gifts we collected together over the years, instead of, you know, putting them into my fund, why we put them in funds to create chairs for the other faculty. So I think when I turned it over, we even had assistant professors coming through to look at jobs saying, what kind of endowed chair am I going to have? So that
it became an expectation.
Yeah, for everyone.
Well, I don't know, I'm sure that part of it is just that you had the chance really as a neurosurgeon to change people's lives in ways that are memorable for them, but I'm sure part of it is also your ability to inspire your patients and to develop relationships with them that makes them want to give. How also did you choose faculty, or how did you kind of inspire them in building a department? Was that a philosophy that you had, or is it just who you are and how you relate to people?
You know, I didn't really have any strict rules about it. I wanted people who were interested in taking good care of their patient, and I think everyone on the team knew that if there was anything that I could give them that they wanted or that I could get for them, I would do my best to do that. I know there are chairmen who have administrative days and that kind of thing. I never had a administrative day, and I wanted the faculty to know that if I was in my office and they needed something or wanted something, that they could always walk in, and that I don't think it was ever by appointment, and certainly my philosophy was that I would do my best to help them get what they wanted, and I certainly wanted them to do a good job, and I, you know, expected they would teach, and we tried to build in a philosophy of service that would make neurosurgery better. So I was always encouraging everyone to get out and speak and take on jobs for the neurosurgical organizations, and I always felt that should be a part of what I did, so that if I had a chance to do something that helped grow and improve neurosurgery as a specialty, I wanted to do that. And I think that philosophy, eventually led to me being asked to do little jobs in the neurosurgical organizations, and I would say virtually every time I was asked to do something, I did it, and that eventually led to me being president of the largest groups in the country, a number of them, and the program directors group in neurosurgery and some of the international groups. And it did put me in a position then to try to get our faculty started and our former trainees into positions that if they got in and worked hard and did a good job, that they would advance. And so a number of our faculty have been presidents of national organizations, and a number of the fellows have been, of the foreign trainees, have been president of Brazilian, president of British, president of Japanese, president of Korean, and societies around the world. And I've tried to teach them that service to neurosurgery is an important part of our mission, and a way of making the specialty better for our patients.
And so service, and it sounds like they knew that you cared about them, and I think that always helps to generate a feeling of security.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If people know that their department chair is genuinely concerned for their well-being, then they feel,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, to some extent protected.
Yeah, I try to give them that feeling. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you wonder, how secure they feel, but, we had a lot of wonderful faculty that a lot of people around the country would have loved to have. And
but people who stayed here because they felt that this was kind of their home? Or?
I think so, and they felt secure and that we would do the best that we could for them.
And so I guess you said you didn't come in with a laundry list of what you wanted for the division or the department, but you clearly have an idea of that improving neurosurgery is important. So I guess I would ask, did you have an idea of where you wanted the profession to be or to go?
Well, in some ways, I wanted to try to stimulate the profession to take good advantage of all the technology that was around. And so we have some endowed chairs in some areas that most people hadn't considered. At the same time that I sort of have had a two-handed view of how I want people and our profession to grow, and one of them is to grow in the skill that we call competence, which is skill and knowledge. And the other side of it is to grow in compassion, which is love and kindness. And I wanted us as a society, as neurosurgeons, those are the areas that I want our school to grow in. I want our students. I want the fellows that have come through the lab. But often in closing up a talk on surgical techniques, why I sort of end with this analogy that is that we want you to turn out to be like the giant oak tree that reaches out with your limbs and branches of competence with skill and knowledge to be better surgeons and physicians. And at the same time, we want you to grow in compassion, which is love and kindness. And like the giant oak tree, why you send your branches deep into the earth to the source of love and kindness, where you replenish your ability to care and to give, and that's the elements of the great physician, the great surgeon. I sometimes, will share with groups that a story that it's the way I look at the profession, that if God came to me as a high schooler and said to me, there's a young person out there who has something that's growing in their head, and it's going to blind them, and then they're going to lose their balance and develop terrible headaches and lapse into a coma, and you're in high school now, and this is what God tells me that he wants me to do. I want you to get good grades in high school so you can get into a good university, and I want you to get good grades in the university so you can get into a good medical school. I want you to do a good job in medical school so you can get a good residency, 7-year residency in neurosurgery. And then I want you to get a 2-year fellowship. And your job after all of that is to fix that one person. And you go through all of that. You meet this one person and you change their lives. You take out that tumor, you change their life. You stop that cycle that was going on, that it would be worth it to go through all of that, to do that one single time. And yet we're in a profession that allows you on a almost daily basis to play an exciting, worthwhile role in people's lives like that every day. And you do it using some of mankind's best technology in what I think of as the pyramids of modern society. Usually the biggest places today in our society are the modern medical centers, so that we're able as physicians on a daily basis to play an exciting role in the lives of others using some of mankind's best technology in what I think of as the pyramids really of modern society. So that's sort of the way I've felt about neurosurgery over the years. Early on, I was probably very timid in delivering that message to neurosurgeons, but I think, after 50 years, it gives me the right to talk to them that way. But another thing I've felt about patients is that your best ally in the treatment of complex neurosurgical illness is a well-informed patient. And so that I've always encouraged our residents, our faculty, to spend lots of time with patients, to make sure that all their questions are answered in your dealings going up to surgery. Make sure that at the end of all your conversation to ask them, have I answered all the questions? Is there anything else you want to know about what we're going to do? And I think that's been a real, rewarding aspect of trying to lead people through what we, through an experience that's sort of like going through the valley of the shadow of death, that and your best friend in all of that is a well-informed patient.
Well, certainly I've been impressed in just in my contact with different programs in neurosurgeries, just how much time is spent with the patients and how much focus there is on education. So I think that certainly seems to be a message that has gone out to the program even today, to the department. I would ask you another question. You mentioned that you were kind of aware of the new technologies and developing chairs in those areas. Can you give a few examples of that? What kind of faculty you would hire to stay, I guess, on top of or ahead of that wave?
Well, I think one example is our radiosurgery program, and I knew that we needed that program, and Dr. Friedman was in radiology, and Dr. Bova was in radiology, and Dr. Friedman was a young faculty member in neurosurgery, and I'd encouraged them to get started with that program, and I initially convinced the hospital board to spend millions of dollars to get some Swedish equipment for doing that, and the board had approved it, and then after getting the board approval for them to get this equipment and get it up and running, they said, I think we can build a better unit than that unit ourselves and do it less costly than what we're going to spend for that Swedish equipment. And I gulped and went back to the board and said, we need to change plans. And we did, and they built a great radiosurgery unit. Along the way, though, one of those donors that had been giving to my lab, I told him about Dr. Friedman and what we wanted to do in that area, and took him with me to meet the trustees of that foundation, and they decided to create a chair in stereotactic surgery. And then another group that I'd been dealing with, I got Dr. Bova involved with, and they had been helping with my lab, but they agreed to help him with a chair in, I forget the exact title of his chair, but it was stereotactic 1 and computer-assisted professor in neurosurgery, the other one, and so that, all of these things sort of woven in together, and today Dr. Friedman, I think, has the Rhoton chair as the chairman, and maybe Dr. Foote has the chair that he had in stereotactic surgery, but and each area we've wanted to really have up-to-date technology in the hospital for helping us manage our patients, and we've tried to build at the same time research that strengthens the base of each of the subspecialty areas within neurosurgery.
So I guess, were you involved then, or did you envision like the movement disorders program?
Yeah, that was one of the things that at one point, when I was at Mayo, I was doing that kind of surgery. And then with medicine, we decided there wasn't much room for that surgery. And then 10 or 12 years ago, there began to a resurgence of that. And Dr. Foote was interested in that. He had come while I was still chairman, and we helped him. It was sort of then at the transition between Dr. Friedman and I that we helped him, and I think when Dr. Friedman got the Rhoton chair, I think he moved the movement or the stereotactic surgery chair. I think it's Dr. Foote now.
And this would also be work with deep brain stimulation?
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. That was the thing that came back. Before, when I was doing it, we were destroying areas of the brain to try to stop some of the hyperactivity in the brain that we thought led to Parkinson's. And then L-DOPA came along and medical treatment became much better. And then we realized, though, that it still left patients with significant problems. And at that point, deep brain stimulation began to develop, and I think we're in the forefront in that area now.
Mm-hmm. Where now it's much more selective, and you can target a few cells rather than having to destroy a large.
Yeah, you can stimulate them without killing them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a much more attractive way, and the targets within the brain, we're learning that they're not just one target. We used to destroy one spot, but now there are multiple targets, and that you can selectively, look at the patient's symptom complex and say, DBS at this site is better for that symptom, or you can do multiple spots and work on selective groups of symptoms. And in vascular surgery, we used to clip almost all aneurysms, which meant a craniotomy. And today, so many of those now we're able to do through catheters and coils and stents, and so that's a whole new area that U of F is in the forefront in, and so that Eblin chair that we had for Dr. Day has gone to that group, and there are new developments in pediatric neurosurgery, and we were able to put together 2 chairs to support research in pediatric neurosurgery. And then there's tremendous new innovation in spine and the way that we stabilize spines and treat scoliosis, and we were able to put together a chair in that area that to facilitate the growth. And I think most of that money goes into fellowships and research and stimulates seed grants and that kind of thing. So it was our vision that, we could grow each of these areas and make it a broad, well-rounded department with leaders in each part of each subspecialty of neurosurgery.
And I guess since a lot of it really does also rely on technology, it's recognizing all along the course of development what will be a new area, and being able to move into that area.
Yeah, and one thing that's helped, it's the motivating goal in all of this has not been money. On the other hand, you need financial support, and one of the good things that helped is the neurosurgery grew. It brought in patients, and neurosurgery was not the biggest revenue producer for the hospital, but it was the biggest net revenue producer. I think at the end of my chairmanship, it had been that way for a number of years, and it's continued I think even today, but that made the hospital willing to invest for our patients in giving us the best in technology, so that I think we were one of the first hospitals in the state to have CT scanning and one of the first to have MRI, and I think we were the first radiosurgery program in the state. And as the specialty has continued to evolve and there's new technology needed to give top-notch care, the clinical activities of the group have made the hospital very willing to invest in that.
Well, and it sounds too as if you can also make choices about and determine the time you spend with the patients. It doesn't sound like you're being driven to say we can only spend 15 minutes with a patient, that you're in a position to essentially take whatever time is needed to explain.
I tell trainees in neurosurgery, and I've even incorporated this into my presidential addresses, that when students get out and come to the world, while you go to a community where the realtors want you to buy the biggest house and they want you to buy a fancy car and join fancy clubs, but the thing that the better mode is to plan a life of saving, and so that you're not driven to have to earn a lot for financial security, but that through a modest way of living and planning, that you develop financial security, and that by doing that, you never have to sit in front of a patient as you're planning sometimes expensive and complicated surgery, that the thought of, I need the money from the income from that procedure, entering into the decision in your mind, consciously or subconsciously, into the decision about what you want for that patient. You want that decision to be, you want to have a financial security and a modest plan of living and saving, so that consideration of maintaining my lifestyle never comes into the equation of what you do that is best for your patient.
So that you can really put their interests first.
Their interests. And I think that's the way it is with physicians. But sometimes it's good to think about those things and plan your life so that, you never allow that to creep into your decision about what is best for someone that you care for.
I guess one question I would ask is how well does that message get rooted in the minds of others?
I know lots of physicians and surgeons that I think it's well rooted, and I think one thing, you talked to me earlier about the young people coming through and their I see the young people in medical school and residency, and their goal is to really, more than anything else, I think, do something worthwhile for humanity. And I think that most physicians, most neurosurgeons, that stays foremost in their thinking, their planning, and their decisions. On the other hand, I can understand at times where, the income that flows through the system and the expectations in many places for physicians to be high spenders, that there is the possibility that financial gain can work its way in subconsciously into some of the motivation and decision making. And I think we need to, if there's any way we can teach and strengthen, management of a lifestyle that doesn't allow that to creep in, it's a good thing.
And I would agree. And I guess from what I've seen of students too, often they don't realize that they have choices, that they think that it has to happen in a particular way, and that they have to go out and practice medicine in a particular way. And oftentimes it's when you explain to them, well, you do have choices. You don't have to see so many patients, or you're choosing how much money you want to earn or you need. But that's something that you have to decide rather than an attitude you just kind of inherit. And so I think that the more they hear that there are choices and that they can, to a large extent, control their practice, that can help them. And that's kind of what you're saying is really that they can choose between the expectations that some people might have, or between, in many ways, having more freedom. And the freedom to make, because it may not just be that financial considerations are entering into the patient care, but also that then they feel trapped into the cycle of, first we have to pay off our debts, and then we're acquiring more debts because we're getting a large house, and then that in the end kind of limits their choices. But so when you and we talked a little bit about kind of maintaining that sense of idealism and the desire to make a difference in the world. And you mentioned one of the analogies that you include in your lecture. How else do you continue to provide that message for students?
I hope it gets woven into the lectures and the things that I do, and the way faculty are managed or develop.
So a lot of it would be by your own example, because we talked
I
earlier.
hope so.
That with your family, where you never told them you should become doctors, but I think much of it had to have been the example that you provided that inspired your own children. And I guess maybe we can go back to talking a little bit more about your own work and your own surgery and your own career, because we've been talking a lot about your work as chair, but throughout your time at UF, you've also been doing your own work. And you mentioned work with pituitary. Could you talk a little bit more? I know that there are approaches to that surgery that you've developed that are unique. Yeah,
that we've helped refine. And pituitary surgery was an area that was done through a craniotomy opening for years, and that was the way it was done when I started in neurosurgery. And decades ago, attempts had been made to do it through the nose, and that just didn't work very well with the equipment available at the time.
And I guess I would just interject, because of the location of the pituitary, if you're going in through the top of the brain, then you had to go through a lot of brain tissue.
Well, you'd go under a lot of brain. You'd have to lift up. It's literally in the center of the head, so that you had to lift up a fair amount of brain, and that subjected that brain to risk. It was long surgery, and so that we began to explore ways of making approaches through the nose to the pituitary safer, and we began to develop some new neurosurgical techniques for going through the nose, and that today has become the standard way of taking out a pituitary. Before, we could never save a pituitary gland in removing a tumor, but today most patients are able to retain their gland when the tumor is removed. We put together a number of instruments for doing that kind of surgery, and when I started out, I knew these things needed to be done. We needed instruments to do them, and I began to give ideas to all the companies, anyone that would talk to me. We need this, we need this. And some of them would come back and, have instruments that were helpful, and eventually some of the companies said, we're selling these instruments, can we call them Rhoton instruments? And they started to call some of them Rhoton instruments, and some of those instruments are still in common use today, decades later. And we did that for multiple areas of neurosurgery. In fact, there's a book out that was written by a fellow named McEwen, who's was on the New York Times bestseller list. The book is called Saturday, and it's a fiction. It's the life of a neurosurgeon, and one of his operations, why he asked for a Rhoton instrument and said that he definitely took out a brain tumor with a Rhoton instrument. And I wondered how that got in there, and I had no idea how it would creep into the language of a British writer. And I was speaking at something in England, and I asked someone, and they said, talk to Neil Kitchens at Queen Square, which is the biggest neurosurgical service in London. And I met Neil, and he told me that McEwen, who had written that and a number of other bestsellers, called him one day and said he wanted to learn about neurosurgery. He was going to write a novel about a neurosurgeon. And Dr. Kitchen said McEwen would come in, make rounds with him for a couple of weeks and go to the OR, and then disappear for a few weeks, and then call him again, come in, and then the novel appeared. So, and Neil said he used those Rhoton dissectors in his operating room, but we've done the same for pituitary and bypass and some other things. And so it's been interesting to see that develop. And I sometimes tell a story that a few years after they started calling them that I was visiting a Cleveland clinic, and And the surgeon, I was a group of surgeons, and we were watching some surgery there as a part of the meeting, and the surgeon said, bring in the Rhoton dissectors, and the circulating nurse brought in the dissectors, and then after the surgeon started to use them, I said to the circulating nurse, she didn't know who I was, what do you know about Rhoton dissectors? And she said, they're made out of a special alloy of steel called Rhoton. So they've sort of made it over decades into a little bit of the culture of the specialty, and it's been fun to see that happen.
So there's the Rhoton dissector. What are some of the other, you mentioned for bypass? What kind of bypass would that be?
For taking arteries and veins, where the carotid artery has been occluded, to take and do grafts directly to the brain arteries, or take the scalp arteries and attach them to the beyond an occlusion site directly to the arteries of the brain.
And what other, you mentioned several other procedures, I'm just curious about the details.
Pituitary, transphenoidal, and some of the things for aneurysms and removal of brain tumors, but some of the things have made their way down the spine too, for spine surgery.
So in the time that we have left today, would you talk about the creation of the Brain Institute?
Well, when I was in training, I spent time at New York Neurologic Institute, which was a wonderful site for clinical and basic neurosciences, and I sort of had the vision that somewhere, someday, that we could play a role in building a brain institute, and that was one of the things that was in the back of my mind when I came to the University of Florida. And I'm sure that during the early time after I arrived here, people grew tired of me talking about the brain as the crown jewel of creation, and then as we started to raise funds, my first endeavors and discussions with individuals, private donors, was to try to stimulate someone to help us create a brain institute, and people didn't seem to buy that concept, but after doing some support from my lab and learning that I was really committed to the place and that I was going to stay here, they began to give larger amounts, and those amounts funded endowed chairs that allowed us to really create some world-class programs. At the same time, the executive committee at the College of Medicine was trying to work out priorities, and when Chandler Stetson was dean and vice president, I began to talk about building a brain institute, and I don't think he thought a lot of the idea or thought that we could do it, but he allowed me to put together this image. He said, I'll let you have illustration, do a picture of a building, and you can show it to donors. And then over the years, the programs related to the endowments continued to grow. And at the same time, the neurosurgical service grew and became a much larger part of the overall clinical effort, and was very productive for the hospital and the medical school. And in the 90s, in executive committee and some of our retreats, all of the areas of medicine, women's health, cardiovascular, cancer, neurosciences were all ranked in retreat by faculty. And when they added up the scores at that time, neurosciences came out in this meeting of department chairmen and deans and vice presidents of the hospital, number one. And I think that focused us in on a course that looked to me like it would eventually lead to Brain Institute. Our fundraising was getting better. And neuroscience department and neurosurgery were located right on the same hallway, right next to each other. And Bill Lutke, who was the chairman, noticed this grant that the military was giving in the neurosciences. It was sort of pork barrel designed to go to the University of Miami, but it was made a competitive grant. And Bill said, let's compete for that. And he started to work on that grant, but the 4 building blocks of that grant were funded by endowed chairs that had come to our department. And so he put that grant together with faculty members that were funded by 4 of our endowed chairs, and it won that competition. And I think the hospital or the medical school health center had to come up with an additional $36 million of some kind of construction cost to match that, but it fell together at the right time, and that created the Brain Institute. But I think that, it was a slow process from the late 70s to having that picture and talking about it and growing the neurosciences, and then having the right people in the right place to compete for that grant that led to the Brain Institute. And it's, for all of us in the neurosciences, it's been a wonderful addition to the university.
And so the Brain Institute houses neurology, psychiatry, neuroscience, and neurosurgery.
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And what are some of the facilities that make it so unique?
Well, I think it's really the faculty that work there. I find it's the most unique aspect of it. But I think it just facilitates and creates focuses on the brain sciences. Another aspect of it that has helped is having the McKnight gift, which is certainly focused additionally on the things that go on there. They've been interested primarily in age-related memory disorder, but it's certainly been a wonderful place for our faculty to grow, and I still have the vision I had wanted at the time that we would build operating rooms and neuroradiology and those things into it. That didn't happen, so I still have the dream that along with this building over next to Shands, we're going to have the Clinical Brain Institute also.
And the Brain Institute has facilities, not so much for the clinical, but a lot of the teaching,
It's the area of the teaching, the labs, the neuroscience labs,
the the magnet?
The conference room, some of the most powerful magnetic resonance imaging going on, some of the most powerful magnets in the world. There's a radiosurgery unit there. There's a lab, gave me a lab for my work and another lab for the teaching, but there's also work going on in endovascular and head injury and spinal regeneration, and a lot of areas that are such strong science that I really don't completely understand them. But the stem cell work goes on there. A lot of genetics of neurological disease, but it's, given us a lot of additional space for labs, created a great place for us to work and collaborate and teach, and for good basic science programs that improve the clinical aspects of neurosurgery.
That's certainly a huge accomplishment. And I have a question. I guess it involves kind of, you talked about your vision for the Brain Institute, but maybe this has to do more with the skills or the particular qualities of being a neurosurgeon. It seems like you mentioned working on kind of computer games for planning surgery. What kind of visualizations as well as hand-eye coordination do neurosurgeons need? Do you think that is different from other surgery?
I think a neurosurgeon to start needs to be of certainly average dexterity without tremor and with a reasonably good set of eyes, although microscopes compensate for that, and endoscopes also do. And I think with those as a basic beginning, with good roadmaps and knowledge and reasonable stamina to do long operations, that those are the sort of basic requirements. But I think it's, it really is a small percentage manual dexterity, and a much greater part is motivation, and just learning to be careful in what you do and understanding what's in front of you, how to preserve it, how to manipulate it, how to clean a tumor or aneurysm off of it. And then some areas where you, like deep brain stimulation, in that you almost don't touch the brain, but you have to understand computer guidance and computer imaging and the biophysics of reaching targets deep in the brains with small probes, and that's maybe a different kind of skill. And so neurosurgery can use people with all kinds of skills, and I think certainly 95% of mastering each of these areas is just good training. I don't know how smart you have to be. I don't think of myself as very smart, having flunked the 5th grade, but if you work at it long enough and hard enough, why, usually you get to where you can do it accurately, gently, and safely. And that's sort of my motto about what we want to do, is learn enough that it's accurate, gentle, and safe, and hopefully improves people's lives.
I think that's a good place to stop for today.
So,
Well, that's wonderful.
so
Thank you very much.
okay, well, thank you for inviting me and pinning me down.